Welcome to our good friends in Tennessee. My name is Bill Baker, and I'm with Firestorm. We're pleased to have you joining us for this webinar today. This is part of the Crisis Coach webinar series, the 2017 series, and we welcome you back after your summer break and getting back to school. We'd like to also have you become our friend. Facebook, we're Firestorm Solutions. Twitter is Firestorm Soul. Yes, there is a hashtag. Hashtag is Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage risk and crises. Firestorm expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communication, crisis public relations, and consequence management. Firestorm is America's crisis coach. We follow a predict, plan, perform methodology. We'd like to remind you the presentation today is not complete without the accompanying oral comments and discussion, and this work product should be discussed in conjunction with advice from your organization's personal counsel. This should not be considered legal advice or legal opinion. The Tennessee Association of Independent Schools has been our sponsor for this for several years now. Dr. Martin and Jill Royka are out working with clients today, and so we excuse them from this webinar, but they will be able to join us next time. We do appreciate everything that the Tennessee Association of Independent Schools does. You can go to firestorm.com where you can watch past webinars in this series, and you can register for future webinars. Our presenter today is our very own Guy Higgins. Guy is in Colorado. He is a graduate of the Naval Academy, and he spent a number of years in flying and also in the aerospace industry. And we're delighted to have Guy with us. He's going to be talking about crisis intuition. Guy, over to you, please.
Thank you, Bill, and I appreciate everybody taking their time this morning. I want to start off telling a story because I'm a storyteller. In 1914, Ernest Shackleton assembled an expedition in England down to the Antarctic continent and crossed the continent on foot. He departed England, northern hemisphere summer, late summer, and down to the Falkland Islands. While he was en route, Europe surfaced into World War I. Shackleton knew this, and he knew that because of was unlikely to get any help from England. He sailed onto the New South Georgia, where he replenished, did his final preparation for the expedition to the Antarctic continent, and talked to the locals. Now he's in the southern hemisphere, so he is in late spring, approaching early summer, and the locals are telling him that the past winter and spring has been the coldest, worst weather that can remember. Sea ice is much more common, much denser. The weather is colder than it has been in memory, and they expect the summer will be the same. To this, sails off just like he planned to do when he was back in merry old England with his expedition, and they sail to the west and into their toward their point of destination and get stuck in sea ice. And the photograph that you see there are all the members of the expedition ice at the bow of their ship, because the ship is locked in the ice solid. For the next 6 or 7 weeks, Shackleton and his expedition amuse and entertain themselves playing games and putting on stage shows and keeping themselves occupied while waiting for the approaching summer, heat of the summer, to break the ship so they can continue with the expedition. Not happening. The ice got colder and more solid, compressed the ship until it eventually crushed the ship, and the expedition and its original goal was no longer practical. expedition take one of their long boats, fill it with all the emergency supplies that they could, cross this sea ice about 100 miles to Elephant Island. The sea ice is not surface like an ice rink. It is incredibly irregular. There are gaps and ridges and chunks all over the place. They nonetheless dragged that boat the 100 miles to Elephant Island, where Shackleton, to accompany him, the rest set up a temporary camp to await rescue, while Shackleton's crewmen rigged the lifeboat, the longboat, with a mast and sail and a partial canvas cover, and they navigate 1,200 nautical miles back to the Falklands, west to east, in some of the worst weather possible, with nothing more than the sun, moon, and stars to navigate. And that's difficult when most of the weather is overcast for most of the time. So Shackleton nonetheless does this, landing on the south coast of New South Georgia, climbs over range into the colony itself, and organizes a rescue expedition. His sailing nautical mile distance is an incredible feat of both navigation and seamanship, and Shackleton for his leadership during that crisis. An example of good leadership. I will boldly assert that it is not, because good leadership doesn't get you into extremis in the first place. In change, leadership takes that into account and has plans for the what if. There's a plan B and a plan C, and if Shackleton had those, he did not exercise them. He got the expedition into extremis. It was his responsibility to get it out. He did a job of doing that, but he did an incredibly bad job of getting him into the problems in the first place. During the rest of this webinar, I'm going to look at 3 pairs of case studies. I'm going to look at the compare and contrast the loss of Malaysia Air Flight 370 with an Air Asia fatal crash. I'm going to look at disasters experienced by British Patrol by Chevron, and I'm going to look at situations and evacuation of the Louisiana State University campus, an intruder incident at Chardon High School in Cleveland. In each one of those case studies, I'm going to look at the pressure that leaders were under. Was the decision-making easy or difficult? What challenges did they face? And were they successful in managing consequences of the event? So without any further look at Malaysia Flight Air Malaysia 70, and that took off from Kuala Lumpur, headed to northeast to a destination in a Boeing 777 with over 200 people on board. About an hour after takeoff, civilian air radar lost radar contact with the airplane. Malaysia Air is a nationally sponsored airline, so the government of Malaysia got on the radio and television and announced that they had lost radar contact with the airplane. That was the only thing that they knew. They had no idea whether it was a communication failure, whether it was some kind of a catastrophic incident, whether the airplane had crashed or pilot error, or knew nothing. Nonetheless, the Malaysian government behaved as if this was something that they had not anticipated. They told people what they knew, but they also told people a lot of things they didn't know. They were under pressure because here a big expensive airplane with a lot of human lives at risk has disappeared. Now, it turns out that it hadn't disappeared. Malaysian military radar continued to maintain contact for another, 30 minutes or so, 40 minutes. And they Malaysian government subsequently had to come out and say, well, we told you we lost radar contact. We actually didn't. We maintained contact for some more, but we've lost it now. And so they're making decisions under pressure, and they're painting a poor picture rather than saying what they knew and not what they anticipated, and so they found themselves having to walk back decisions. It turns out that even later that the airplane continued to radio telemetry data on the status of the airplane back from the airplane to the airline and to the manufacturer, and that allowed subsequent reconstruction of the route that's shown on that graphic there, back over the Malaysia Peninsula and back out into the Indian Ocean, where it eventually disappeared for good. Was the decision-making easy or difficult for them? Well, heavens to Betsy, it was very difficult. And it was difficult because it's apparent that the Malaysian government hadn't thought about how they were going to make decisions. What decisions would they face, and were there any ethical challenges? Well, human lives are at stake, so there's certainly ethical challenges. And that increased the amount of pressure on them. The decisions they made were to continually paint a rosy picture and to pass responsibility to someone other than the airline and the government, because they didn't want the government to be damaged by the loss of this airplane. They were not successful at that. They did not succeed at managing consequences. Air has suffered brand and reputational damage, and it has still, some of the lingering effects of that are still present in the operation of the airline today. Looking at AirAsia after the disappearance of MH370, AirAsia lost an airplane shortly after takeoff when it crashed. Now, in this situation, AirAsia knew exactly what would happen. It's a low-cost airline, not government-sponsored, so it's the responsibility of corporate leadership to deal with this. The behavior of corporate leadership indicates that AirAsia had a plan. Not only did they have a plan, they probably exercised the plan because they behaved very quickly, very straightforward manner. They immediately announced the crash of the airplane and told people that that had happened because they knew it. They did not know why. They did not know how many fatalities, but they were certain that there had been some fatalities just by virtue of the location of the crash and the impact. So they told people that and committed to keeping people informed. They also accessed the manifest, identified emergency points of contact, contacted those people, established an emergency operations center at the departure airport, offered to fly emergency points of contact and family to the emergency operations center. The CEO traveled to the emergency operations center and addressed the people who were there, committed to coming back and addressing them again when information changed, provided food and lodging for the people who were there, and the CEO went and spoke individually to people whose families and friends had been on that airliner. AirAsia behaved very straightforwardly. Were they under pressure? Sure, they were under pressure, but they were under less pressure than Malaysia Air was, because they had a plan and they were making decisions and they were acting forthrightly and transparently. Their decision making was much easier than that faced by the Malaysian government. Their ethical challenges were much lower because they'd already talked about those things and had decisions pre-made, and therefore they were much more successful at managing the downstream consequences, and they're up and operating just fine today and essentially since the time of the crash. Going on to look at British Petroleum and Chevron, probably people remember the Deepwater Horizon catastrophe that BP experienced several years ago in the Gulf of Mexico. As a refresher, BP had a drilling platform, the Deepwater Horizon drilling platform, that experienced a blowout at the wellhead. That blowout resulted in an explosion and fire on the drilling platform. Two things resulted. 11 people were killed on the drilling platform, and there was an uncontrolled flow of crude oil from the well into the Gulf of Mexico. British Petroleum, like Malaysia Air, behaved as if they hadn't had a plan in place to deal with some kind of a situation like this. They were under enormous pressure because there are people dead and there's environmental catastrophe ongoing. British Petroleum, like Malaysia Air, elected in an ad hoc manner to paint an optimistic picture of the situation, that they would get the wellhead capped and reduce the amount of oil dumped into the Gulf of Mexico, and that the flow of oil was low. Well, it turns out that a day or so later, BP had to walk that assertion back because it turns out that the flow was at first hundreds of gallons an hour, then thousands of gallons an hour, then 10,000s of gallons an hour. And they had to continually walk back those optimistic assessments of the situation and talk about how quickly they would be able to cap the well. And as you may or may not remember, it took several days to get the well capped and the flow ended into the Gulf, an incredibly environmentally sensitive area, high economic value in the Gulf from both tourism and the maritime industries associated with the Gulf. Was decision-making easy for BP? No, it was incredibly difficult. They were facing very difficult ethical challenges with respect to both the environment and in the face of the loss of 11 lives on the drilling platform. Those challenges should have been thought about ahead of time, and BP should have been prepared to address those honestly, but with a very forthright manner, and to talk to people about how they would create a better future for BP and their stakeholders. And the stakeholders, of course, involved essentially everybody whose living was associated with the Gulf of Mexico. They very poorly managed the consequences of that, and as many of you undoubtedly noticed, there are still commercials running on television where BP is asserting their environmental commitment and sensitivity, managing those consequences even now, years later. In contrast to that, Chevron's oil refinery in Southern California experienced an explosion and fire. Now, BP had tried to manage communication through press conferences and press releases, and their press conferences resulted in their CEO saying, "I just want my life back." Not a good message. Chevron used press conferences and press releases too. They coordinated press conferences with first responders, but they also got on Twitter right away. Within minutes of the explosion, Chevron got on Twitter and said, "Hey, we're here. We're going to talk to you guys on Twitter about this explosion. We know there's been an explosion. We know there's a fire. As we find out more facts, we'll tell you." And within minutes, they had another tweet out there. You know, first responders are on scene. We believe that the fire will be contained within X number of hours, a pessimistic observation. We'll get back to you. They continued these tweets every 3 to 5 to 10 minutes throughout the day until the fire was contained and put out. They committed to making it good. They told people that there were some minor injuries but no fatalities. They verified facts beforehand. This is important because it is obvious from that Twitter stream that Chevron had thought about how they were going to address their various stakeholders, what media channel they were going to use, and what the tone of their messages would be, and how they would deal with their assessment of it and the ethical challenges associated with it. They were transparent. They managed the consequences. They committed to making it right, and Chevron suffered virtually no downstream consequences from this event. Once again, the appearances that BP didn't have a plan, Chevron had a plan, and they practiced it and they exercised it well. We want to talk now about a situation that occurred at Louisiana State University. Several years ago, there were a series of bomb threats at universities throughout the United States. Some of those bomb threats were real. They're real bombs on the campuses. Some of them were fakes. Louisiana State University, therefore, honestly and legitimately said, we got to treat this as a real bomb threat. And it's apparent that they had a plan, because they immediately tweeted this message: "A bomb threat's been reported on the LSU campus. Please evacuate calmly and quickly as possible." Okay, so they had a plan. They knew they would use Twitter because that'll get the message out to most people fastest. Good idea. However, it's not apparent that LSU had thought about what would result after they sent that tweet out. Now, the LSU campus is about 360 acres. No matter how you draw a footprint of that 360 acres, no place is further than 400 or 500 yards from off campus. Almost every single person on the LSU campus could walk those 400 or 500 yards to get off campus. Is that what happened? Of course not. This is America. Everyone ran out and jumped in their car and joined one of the world's longest linear parking lots, creating a traffic jam that lasted for hours. Now, this traffic jam restricted the ability of people to get off campus in their car, so those few people who needed to be able to drive off campus because they couldn't walk couldn't get off campus. The people who could walk couldn't get off campus. Emergency responders, firemen, policemen, emergency disposal EMTs couldn't get on campus easily. And so we have a situation of flow down. The failure of LSU to think through what would have happened here created a secondary risk to the people on the LSU campus. And it's important to think through this. If LSU had taken their plan and had trained people on it and had exercised it, it's likely someone would have thought about, gee, after an LSU home football game, it always takes a couple hours to clear the parking lot. What would happen if we had everybody try to get out of the LSU campus at one time? Well, you might have the same problem. Okay, most people can walk. We'll do that. We'll put that in the message. Walk off campus as calmly and quickly as possible. But that was not what happened. So it's important to not only have the plan, it's important to practice the plan. Now, Chardon High School had a plan, and they had practiced it. They practiced it for an armed intruder scenario. Within a couple days after the time they had that practice, they had an armed intruder event when a student entered the cafeteria and shot 2 other students. Chardon High School responded immediately. They knew what to do. Called a lockdown, called 911. Faculty that were in the cafeteria took control of the student with the gun, disarmed him, and essentially within a couple of minutes, the event was over. And that's excellent. The average armed intruder event lasts 4 minutes. The average first responder response time is 7 minutes. That's not a shot at the first responder. 7 minutes is an incredibly rapid response. Incredibly rapid response. But Chardon High School recognized that their staff and faculty were already there. That's an instantaneous response if you have a plan and you practiced for it. Now, like LSU though, Chardon High School hadn't thought all the way through this. So when they called lockdown, they had a high school full of 14, 15, 16, 17, 18-year-olds, all of whom had a smartphone. And they immediately became broadcasters. Now, what were they broadcasting? They were broadcasting fact-free suppositions, rumors, and assertions. Because these students are locked down in the various rooms throughout the school. They know nothing about what's going on. Very few that were in the cafeteria have some idea that there was a shooting. They have no idea who or what or why or how or what the results were, but they know there was a shooting. But nonetheless, Fox News, Fox Business News, CNN, CNBC, MSNBC, ABC, CBS are all out there, the Cleveland Plain Dealer, they're all out there taking these tweets, tweeting back to the kids, getting more information, and gleefully publishing this on the internet and live television. Almost everything that anybody learns within the first few minutes, hours of an event is wrong. And certainly a lot of that information was wrong, but it's going out on the internet to all the parents and guardians of these kids in Chardon High School, all of whom are concerned about their kids and who are pressing on the leaders to make decisions. Was there pressure? Absolutely. And while the initial response and everything, decision-making was very clear, clean-cut and clear, and Chardon had thought about it, and they managed consequences of it, the flow out of the press blow-up afterwards was something they hadn't thought through, which emphasizes the importance of sometimes bringing in outside experts to take a look at that, or bringing in someone who has knowledge and look at that to be able to vet your plans for you. So it is developing the plans, vetting the plans, training the plans, and exercising them that is critical, because you find these kinds of issues. Nonetheless, Chardon High School did an excellent job, and they should be commended for being able to do that. They certainly minimized the fallout of that particular event. So leadership doesn't just start when you find yourself frozen in the ice off the Antarctic. Leadership starts before that does. What's the strategy? What's our approach to responding to an event, to recovering from an event, to reestablishing operations as normal? What are the considerations we have to go through? Are we legally bound to make certain reports, to do certain things? If so, what are those things, and how do we know we have them all? What about regulations? Are we required to do any reporting under regulations? Does state or federal law require us to report some kind of a hazardous material spill in a high school chem lab? has to be answered. What are those restrictions, and can we streamline that process somehow looking downstream? What are our ethical challenges? We have an organization out here called I Love You Guys. I Love You Guys has a wonderful website, and they say that it's important to remember that the fire department owns the flames, the police own the criminal, the school owns the students. And so anything that disrupts the school ethical responsibility to make sure that every student is reunited with their approved, appropriate parent or guardian. And that's not an easy chore. That's an ethical consideration that has to be taken by the school when they're establishing their strategy for responding to these kinds of events. Once those strategies are developed, they need to be converted into plans, and the plans need to be incredibly specific. Who is going to do what, and how are they going to do it? Is it going to be a press release, or is it going to be Twitter? Is it going to be the head of communications talking to the media, or is it going to be the principal or the vice principal? Who's not authorized to talk to the media? Once those plans are in place, train everybody. Most people's responsibility under the plan will simply be to follow direction, to lock down or lock out or evacuate, but they have to know what that means. My business partner, Jennifer Friedman, and I were doing a work for a local school that has a campus with 17 buildings on it. During lunch break, we walked across the campus and stopped and asked the student that if lockdown were called right now, or lockout were called right now, what would they do? And they said, well, we'd run back inside. We said, no, you wouldn't, because you're locked out. But that kind of training needs to take place. They need to understand what the vernacular is, what the words are, and what they're supposed to do when those words are used. And then there need to be exercises, fire drills, evacuation drills, lockdowns, lockouts, and they need to be conducted at times that are not necessarily convenient, because emergencies and crises do not schedule ahead of time to make the exercise or to make the event convenient. So for every strategy and every plan, there's a barrier. Those barriers include attitudes, disaster denial. Not going to happen to us. Well, you can't say that. How long are you going to keep doing what you're doing? Maintaining the school, educating students. If you don't plan to stop doing that next year, then you can't say it's never going to happen to us. And you can't say just because it hasn't happened in the past. I was working with McDonnell Douglas at the time in St. Louis, and they had a 100-year flood. Then the next year, they had another 100-year flood. So you can't say it won't happen to us, or it just happened to us, so it won't happen again. No, disasters don't schedule, like I said. We've seen what we have is good enough. Well, it may be good enough, but until you have vetted it, until you have trained on it, until you have scrubbed it hard and exercised it, you don't know that it's good enough. And so it's important to do those things. We've encountered organizations that say, we're really good problem solvers. We have this great history of successfully solving problems. We don't need plans. Well, you know, that's not a good enough idea. You do need plans. The best athletes in the world still have game plans, even though they are the best athletes in the world. They have game plans, and they train on those game plans, and they exercise those game plans against an opponent. Important to do that. Organizations have conflicting priorities. Schools have a priority of educating their students, but they have a priority of making sure that they're prepared to keep those students safe too. And so there are those priorities, and there's an issue with resources. Nobody has more resources than they need. And so you need to be able to allocate those resources in accordance with the priorities, because otherwise you'll find yourself in the situation where you set out to drain the swamp, and now you're up to your ears in alligators, and it's really tough to remember that you were going to drain the swamp because alligators are nasty. So it's important. Establish those priority resources and get it done. And culture can help you there, or it can be a barrier. If your culture involves disaster denial, or the thought that we don't need plans because I'm trained to respond ad hoc, you've got the leadership of the organization, principals, vice principals, staff, and faculty need to work on that culture and create a culture of preparedness. And that involves creating ownership, because staff, faculty, and students who own the plan, this is our plan, because I actually had an input to it. And that can help you with the execution, because I'll execute my plan a lot better than I'll execute that bag of donuts gave me. Now, strangely enough, legal opinion can be a barrier too. If we go back and look at the way that BP responded through press releases and press conferences, those press releases were vetted with BP legal counsel. If we go back and look at Chevron, Chevron got on Twitter, they had to have legal opinion pre-approve, if they were going to approve at all, the message, not necessarily the words, but the content of those tweets. Legal counsel had to be involved up front. And so legal opinion can be a barrier. You need to plan for that and bring the attorneys onto your side to be part of the team, not part of the problem. That's what leadership has to be able to step forward and do. Overcoming those barriers, participative leadership rather than directive leadership. Reach out, bring on board the people who will be implementing and intimately involved with the execution of the plans. Ask their opinion, involve them, use their ideas, take advantage of that resource rather than just the resource of leadership, putting together a plan and publishing it. Communicate, why are we doing this? Be transparent about it. We're doing this so that we can continue to provide a quality education because we have ensured the safety and well-being of our students, staff, and faculty. We've done it. That's why we're doing this. That's why we're committing resources, both in terms of time and money, to doing this, and then follow through with the training and the exercises so that there is that ownership, so that there is that experience with it, and that people execute those things in a disciplined and effective manner. What does that do for you? Building those things builds muscle memory, just like a professional athlete out there responds quicker than thought to certain situations. By having done the training and done the exercises, you'll develop that same kind of muscle memory. And that muscle memory translates into experience. The more exercises you have, the more times you go through the plan, the more experience you build, and that experience integrates into intuition. Intuition is not something magical that we're born with. It is the experience that allows us to act more quickly than a cognitive thinking through all of the steps in real time will allow you to do. I've done this before, this feels right. I know that I have confidence to do this because it's worked before, okay? And I don't have to think through, gee, what the heck is going on now and where in the plan is that going to be? You can do that very quickly, and that all brings together better performance. So muscle memory creates the ability to go through this and develop the experience base, which results in an ability to make intuitive decisions. All of that builds confidence, which results in better performance in actual situations. So as you can see, the strategy supports the planning, supports the training, supports the exercises. All of that develops the muscle memory, the experience, the intuition, the confidence, and you result with better, more effective performance that allows you to manage consequences downstream and enhance your reputation. So leadership during pre-action, before the crisis, creates the team, creates the plan, creates the experience. It's really important to walk through that and develop that. That becomes a value stream for the school. During a crisis, that takes over, that muscle memory, that intuition, that experience, that confidence. And there's no need for you to haul that longboat across 100 miles of ice and to establish a temporary camp while you sail off 1,200 miles to some island and create an expedition to come back and rescue everybody. You don't need to be a superhuman leader if you've done the leadership up front. You can be an effective and efficient leader without needing to be the superhero. So with that, there will be a brief of this. and I have time, so I'm going to tell you a story that will, I hope, provide a little bit of emphasis to the, started with a story, finished with a story, will provide a little emphasis to what I've just talked about. I had the opportunity to work for Vice Admiral 3-star Paul McCarthy, and he told me an experience that he'd had in his career. He had been the Navy captain commander of the USS Midway, an aircraft carrier in the Western Pacific. And shortly after he took command, they had a war game. And Paul said, it was a disaster. He said, if we'd had to go to war at that time, he says, we would have all been sitting in our life rafts. It was just a complete and utter disaster. The next year, they had another war game, but Paul had been there for a year, and he had taken advantage of that experience, and he had developed plans, and they had trained on those plans, and he said, we did better, did a lot better. The next year, Paul had been promoted to 1-star, and he was now the commander of the carrier group. And they had their war game, and now Paul, who brought along some of his staff who had the experience and who had passed down experience to the people who had come on board new to replace people who had been ordered out, they had that experience, and they had the plans, and they did even better at the carrier group level and the carrier level. And then a year later, Paul had been promoted to his 2nd-star and was now a task force commander. And with more ships under his command and the advantage that they had in the past and the planning that they were doing and the exercising, they got ready for the war game, and they did very well at that war game. And the next year, they did even better. The following year, Paul was promoted with his 3rd-star and was the commander of the U.S. 7th Fleet. And when they had the war game out there, Paul had the advantage of all that personal experience plus the knowledge stream and corporate knowledge that his staff and the task force staff and the car crew staff and the ship staff had and developed over time. They had built that knowledge value stream and that corporate knowledge, and they did an excellent job his last year out there. But they had been training and exercising on plans for 7 years. And so you can see that having the strategy, doing the planning, doing the training, doing the exercises builds on that performance. And that was something that was apparent when we looked at AirAsia, when we looked at Chevron, when we looked at Chardon High School. It was not apparent when we look at what Ernest Shackleton had to do to recover his men safe and sound. Not apparent in Malaysia Air, not apparent in British Petroleum, and not completely apparent in LSU. So LSU had a plan. It wasn't apparent that they thought through it and wire brushed it. So with that, Bill, we have a couple of minutes. Do we have any questions?
No, we don't have any questions. Appreciate your comments.
Okay, well.
Good storytelling, Guy.
So everybody can download a copy of this, copy of the brief that captures this from the Firestorm website, so that you have that as a reminder of what we said. There will be a recording of this, right, Bill, on the Firestorm website?
Yes, we should have the recording of this session out in about 2 hours.
Okay, and so with that, we have a couple of minutes to give people 5 or 6 minutes of their lives back.
Okay, thank you. Be sure to join us next month for another Tennessee Association of Independent Schools webinar. Thank you, Guy.